Thank you for speaking today. I think that's very well said. And there is one thing which maybe when I introduce my wonderful panelist and we get into our conversation that maybe even is relevant. One of the kids, I think it was Alex, or maybe his brother it was his brother said at one point, that in an effort to quit, he bought a product called Zyn, which is a flavored nicotine pouch. I just want to point out those are not nicotine replacement therapy products. And in fact, those flavored pouches, I mean, we think that, these may be industry attempts to confuse consumers because they do appear like nicotine replacement therapies, NRTs, which don't go through the Center for Tobacco Products at FDA. They go through the CEDAR, the Center that evaluates drugs, but they're all in these fabulous flavors, and they are still out on the market because there have not been any decisions made. So that relates to what we're about to discuss, which is called Fox in the Henhouse, which is how the tobacco industry infiltrates schools and funds its own research. Again, we've talked a lot over the last day about the duplicitous tactics and predatory behavior of the industry, and I'm really honored to be able to introduce the panelists to talk about this with. That is Pamela Ling, MD, MPH, who is director for the Center for Tobacco Control Research and Education and a professor of medicine at USC. So Pam, also a great partner. It's so good to see you. And I really appreciate your taking the time to help us make sense of some of the outrageous examples of the industry's duplicitous behavior. And the reference to the fox in the henhouse is like, what are you going to have, a fox guard the henhouse? Which, again, putting the tobacco industry in schools, which, Pam, as you know, that's our origin story, right? This all started for us because a Juul representative came into our son's school and said Juuling was totally safe. So welcome and thank you.
Great. Thanks, Meredith. It is always hard to follow the youth panel because they're so wonderful, and I'm feeling kind of old and stodgy.
Well,
And especially because I'm a researcher, like I brought slides because, the researchers bring slides. So I'm going to share my screen with some slides. But since we don't have a break, I also invite, if you're watching, if you want to stand up and stretch,
okay,
wiggle your body around a little bit, that would be a good thing because I certainly going to do that while I share my screen. All right.
Thank you.
And you tell I used to teach aerobics at some point. All right. Meredith, interrupt me if you want to. Going to just show about 10 minutes of slides. We're going to talk about the industry and really why the industry does two things. One is, why does the industry fund research? And second is, why does the industry do youth smoking or youth vaping prevention programs? And, I'm from UCSF, where we actually have an archive of over 90 million pages of previously secret tobacco industry documents. And this is available on our website. You can go to this website, you can type in the search bar basically any term related to tobacco, and you can get copies of documents from industry internal files, right, that tell you what industry folks knew or thought about the topic. And so one aspect of my research has been looking into industry behavior and using the documents to understand it.
Well, I'd be interested, Pam, after July 1st, we talked yesterday about the documents about Juul that will be coming out of the North Carolina. So I hope you'll get a chance to look at those, and I can only.
Yeah, I hope we get those. Yes, and that is one of the nice things that comes out of this litigation, right? Is that people now have made a practice of saying, we don't seal the documents; we need to make the documents public so that other people can benefit from seeing those plans. So we're going to go a little bit. So in terms of research, we're going to go a little bit back in time to why tobacco companies fund science. This is if we go back to the 50s, when it first came out that people said, smoking might cause lung cancer, the industry's response was to fund science. Right, they took out this full-page ad in over 400 newspapers, reaching over 43 million people. This frank statement ad is very famous because the industry basically said, we've heard that maybe smoking is bad for your health. We're on it. We don't know for sure that that's true, and we're going to fund a bunch of science to find out. And as soon as we find out, we'll let you know. And this tactic of funding science um, in the 50s was the way that the industry actually delayed policy. So they were saying we can't take action on smoking because we don't know yet whether smoking is really a cause of cancer. And they were able to delay action for decades by generating controversy about smoking and health.
Can I ask you a quick question, if you don't mind? Because
Yeah.
at that time, did they already know that it did?
Yes, internally, they already had evidence internally that smoking caused health problems.
I thought so.
And this is why, in part, why the this research committee that they talk about in this frank statement that they're starting, they eventually had to dissolve the committee because it was really seen as just fraudulent. You know, the industry already knew that smoking caused health problems, and they created this whole controversy to delay action. Um, the second thing that this did was, of course, it positions the industry as your partner. So not the perpetrator of the problem, but really, part of the solution. And of course, that helps tobacco companies too.
Oh, you mean like PMI, the Foundation for a Smoke-Free?
Smoke-free world. Yeah, exactly the same positioning. So this is what they started doing in the 50s. Here's another internal document from like 30 years later, right? Where RJ Reynolds Tobacco Company is doing the same thing. This came out right after the Surgeon General's report said nicotine was addictive like heroin. And nicotine's the reason why people get addictive. RJ Reynolds said, "Oh no, we need to do research on nicotine." Because they really were motivated to say we need to show nicotine is maybe beneficial. Maybe it helps with stress and focus. And we don't want it to be like heroin. We want it to be seen like caffeine in your coffee.
But when were the Waxman hearings, the infamous Waxman hearings?
Waxman hearings
Senator, that was later. But I mean, so they already, but they still in the 90s, when the seven dwarves were asked by now Senator, then Congress member Ron Wyden, is nicotine addictive? No. Is nicotine addictive? No. But they did know because they knew back then, correct?
Yes, exactly. So so this is before that, but here RJ Reynolds, in response to a Surgeon General's report, is funding science, and here's their internal document saying why they're doing it. Right, they want to know about nicotine, but they also say that this is going to be a way for RJ Reynolds scientists to gain credibility and access to leading scientists in nicotine research throughout the world. So it's both them contributing to this literature or controversy, but it's also giving them credibility. So now you mentioned this already, Meredith, right? The Foundation for a Smoke-Free World is kind of the newest iteration of this, right? Philip Morris International says they're investing $1 billion in research to end smoking. And all this research is around these new tobacco products and saying we need to position these as potential harm reduction for smokers who can't quit. And they're really fueling controversy about e-cigarettes and a certain type of research that really supports the promotion of these new products. This is a study that we did. So when you wonder like what's the impact, right, of industry funded science, this is one example of a study we did where we took all the papers that we could find that were published about tobacco harm reduction from the time the term came into vogue up through about 2016. And we just looked at whether or not they said, you should promote these new products as harm reduction, which is like pro harm reduction, that's red, versus if you were skeptical and you said, these new products have a problem and we shouldn't promote them, those are in the green here. And we looked at whether or not people disclosed in the paper that they were getting money from tobacco companies, e-cigarette companies, or from pharmaceutical companies. Now we know that a lot of people who get money from the tobacco companies don't even disclose it. But we just looked at the papers and what people actually put in their disclosures.
Were you looking just at the American Journal of Public Health or others?
No, this paper is published in the American Journal of Public Health, but we looked at everything published we could find in 3 databases.
We actually just went to the American Journal of Public Health complaining about 2 researchers who did not make disclosures about relationships to, in one case to Juul and in one case to PMI.
Yeah, this is, this is something we can talk about more, but it is a major problem, right? People don't disclose there, and they'll say, oh, I forgot, or oh, it wasn't really related. And disclosure is kind of like the lowest bar, right? Because there are so many ways to put bias in science, outside of just disclosing that you got money from a company with a conflict of interest. But what we found here was we looked at whether people got money or not, or some other kind of support. And then we just looked at the conclusions of their paper, the discussion section, which is kind of the recommendations, like you should promote these new products, or you should not promote them. And you can see that if you didn't receive any funding from industry, which is the top line, the field is about split. It's about 50-50. Some people think that you should, other people are skeptical. But when you look at the literature that's supported by e-cigarette companies, tobacco companies, and pharmaceutical companies, then the odds of them saying we need to promote these products as harm reduction is between 2 and almost 60 times higher.
What a surprise, Pam. What a shock.
Yeah, maybe not surprising, but it certainly shows that, while not every paper, published in the literature, or every paper from even companies with conflicts of interest is, fully in support of harm reduction, there's just enough to tip the balance. And the industry, of course, people know which side their bread is buttered on, or they know, even if they say that the research was independent, they tend to make conclusions that support the industry's bottom line. So the bottom line on industry-funded research is that, it helps to shape scientific dialogue. So in the 50s, it helped to create controversy about smoking and health. Now what it's doing is it's creating an evidence base to support harm reduction and the promotion of these new products. This, of course, also gives the industry a way to influence regulators and regulations, gives them a seat at the table. And when you design a study, right, if you can pick out, how you define what harmful is. Do you just look at carcinogens? Do you just look at certain components? All of those things are really powerful ways that industry can influence its own regulation.
Can I want to ask you one example that I want you to maybe quickly remind us of, and then I want to ask you a question about this. The example would be a full issue of a peer-reviewed journal that Juul paid for with all of its own science. That was just, I think, within the last year. Maybe you could just very quickly give us a real-time example of that.
So just last year, right, there was an issue of the American Journal of Health Behavior that it was like a special issue that was funded by Juul, and it had a lot of papers showing that Juul is good for harm reduction and help people quit smoking, and until you really kind of looked at it, at first it just looks like a legitimate journal, and of course we need science on Juul, right? It was the product was new, and so people were very hungry to find out, what do we know about the science on it, right? But you had to kind of pay attention to realize that actually every paper in the special issue was either funded by Juul, had Juul employees, or consultants for Juul, and the whole editorial of the issue was also the editor was also connected to Juul through consulting, which and typically that journal actually has a very good reputation.
I think it had 2 weeks before, wasn't it, sold to someone else?
Yeah, I think they sold it to someone. So
right, well,
once people found out that this was a huge problem in terms of conflict of interest. But I think it really does show how when the industry has the opportunity to to buy a scientific journal or to buy a special issue, they can definitely do it, and then those papers, of course, get put forward to FDA. Get put in front of decision makers and policy makers, and they just say, here's evidence that Juul will help people quit smoking, and we need to support it.
Well, I'm glad you brought up FDA, because before we switch to the real fox in the hen house and the school issue, I just want to ask you, when FDA receives a pre-market tobacco application, the PMTAs we've been talking so much about, and for, let's say, menthol Juul, isn't the science by definition, the scientific evidence that purports to show that these products are for the, appropriate for the protection of public health? That's the standard, right? Isn't that industry funded science by definition? So that would mean that Juul and Puff Bar, whoever, is using its own funds to hire its own scientists to present its best case for why this should be approved. So is that correct, number one? And so where's the independent third party scientific survey that looks at the product? Is that what the FDA itself, FDA's scientists are supposed to be doing in reviewing the PMTA? How does that work?
So I mean, I'm not an FDA person, so I don't exactly know, but it is, I think you're right that when the companies, right, put in these applications, a lot of the science that they're producing is their own, that they funded and produced and designed, right? So sometimes that's the only science that's available. Part of the FDA's job is to review, whether the studies were conducted, ethically, and whether they had the right outcomes and what was the design. But and sometimes it's difficult for independent folks to really even get a good look at, because we kind of are limited sometimes on,
right, that's why you say here independent research on new tobacco products is critical. Okay.
Yeah. So we definitely need. We definitely need to have folks who don't have a conflict of interest also studying the products. And it's true that FDA should also be taking into account. I mean, they take into account industry funded research, but they also really need to take into account other independent science and also pay attention to what's not there. Right? Like the companies will tend to put, for something like these new products, they'll tend to put a lot of emphasis on studies among smokers, right? Or smokers may be quitting, or smokers may be reducing their cigarettes, and then saying, well, reducing your cigarette is almost as good as quitting, which is an assumption. But they often will not have any research on youth.
Right. Or they'll give a 5-day study. After 5 days, this happened with no long-term, see people quit, when in fact the dual use issue would come up if you looked at it later. I mean, if you looked at it over a longer period of time.
Right. So like these sophisticated things on when you are measuring your outcome, right?
Right.
And on the one hand, I don't think it's ethical for the companies to be doing research on kids, but you need youth research to be done independently, and the FDA, before making a decision, needs to pay attention to say, oh, you know what, there's a whole other population that's affected by this product. And we need to we shouldn't only rely, right, on the research that the industry is putting out.
Right. And plus, someone is commenting to me, these MRT that, those PMTAs are not public, right? So we can't see what was the science. But anyway, because we don't, I wish we could talk about this all day, the industries, the fox and the hen house issue, and talk about the rebranding of the tobacco industry. But I guess what's next is that
let me tell you a little bit about youth programs. And
please, I know about this, but as I said, this was something that affected us personally. So we're really interested to talk about this.
So the youth programs actually started by tobacco companies in the 80s. And the purpose of the youth programs was actually to avoid government regulation. So when the industry started losing policy battles, the solution was we need to do something about this youth problem. And internally they said, if we had a program to discourage teens from smoking, maybe that would delay further regulation of the tobacco industry. So tobacco companies have always seen youth programs as policy tools. There are a couple different kinds. Oh, here's another quote from Philip Morris. We need to do something fast to project a sense of industry responsibility about youth access. Otherwise, we're going to be facing severe marketing restrictions. So what we see from the internal documents is that the Tobacco Institute and later the tobacco companies roll out a youth program in communities where they're seeing some policy they don't want. So if they're going to put in, in this case, nowadays it might be a flavor ban, right? Local flavor ban is going to happen. They'll roll out the youth program in that community. And historically, that's what they did when looking at clean indoor air laws or other kinds of marketing restrictions. That's when the youth program would come out. The messaging in the youth programs can also be kind of subtly tilted towards the industry. This is a poster from RJ Reynolds' youth program called Right Decisions Right Now. They focus on things like smoking is an adult choice. They focus on peer pressure, which, as we heard from the youth, is a real thing, right? But they never talk about predatory marketing, or they wouldn't say we need to ban flavored tobacco, right? They could just say you need to stand up to peer pressure, and that's it.
Well, also, one of the moms was saying earlier in that the youth panel, the choice is yours. What teen doesn't want to think that the choice is theirs? That actually doesn't.
Right. So the meta and the messaging can also be very weak, right? And what the industry does is they'll put up this program for free and say, you're a school district and you don't have any money, you can use our free program. And unless you really understand that, like, what the industry is doing and how these can subtly go against the purposes, you look like, if you're coming in as a concerned mom, you look a little crazy saying, well, I don't think this youth program is a good idea. And
well,
the industry knows that.
Well, so it's so interesting, and I don't want to, but just to give the present day or recent past example, I remember when we were testifying in 2019 at the Jewel hearing run by the House Oversight Subcommittee with Raja Krishnamurthy, what came out was, in fact, Jewel then in 2018 was going to, and we had read about this very early on. We came across some kind of blog post in California with educators, and they were warning their colleagues, don't take meetings with this former school superintendent who's being paid by Jewel to talk about promoting their curriculum. And they were offering, which, as we later found out, some of which had been taken without legal authority from Dr. Bonnie Halpern-Felsher's anti-tobacco information at Stanford, but they were offering underfunded school districts $10,000, which was a lot of money for those districts to, quote, use their curriculum. So it's this what we talked about yesterday, right? Same playbook.
Yeah, and it can be hard to argue against it. Right? If people don't have really an understanding of, like, what the industry's intent to do and how it will actually work against your kids, because they'll put the program in your school so that you don't ban flavors in your community. Unless you can kind of see that big picture and put it together, people say, well, why not take the 10 grand and the free program? So that can be hard to argue against. The tobacco companies have also historically done programs directed at parents, like how to talk to your kids about not smoking. They look a lot like other programs that public health folks do, trying to give parents support on talking to your kids. And talking to your kids, of course, is a great thing. But again, this kind of frames the youth smoking or youth vaping as, like, in some ways it says that if your kid then starts vaping, it's because you didn't talk to them enough, right? It doesn't, they really avoid talking about the industry's role in promoting the products, putting out the message that this is going to help your mental health, attractive flavors. Like, those things get kind of whitewashed out of these messaging. And then parent programs also are designed to have voters think something's already happening. Right. So if they publicize parent programs to voting parents and then say, you don't need to spend any more money on youth programs, or you don't need a flavor ban, because there's already a lot being done about this. It's again designed to interrupt policy. So that's historically how they're used. And then the retailer programs is another thing that tobacco companies invented. Everyone sees We Card in every convenience store, right? And again, like,
I don't really, but
we've heard from the youth, right? Like, a quote, you do need to card people, right? Otherwise they can just buy whatever. Right. But the industry used We Card programs as a way to reach out to local retailers and train them on how to card people. But also they said to them, if you hear of any local legislation in your community, you should let us know.
Yeah, so we can fund our lobbyist. We can have our lobbyist.
They can send a lobbyist, exactly. So the industry, is very strong at the national level and the state level, but locally, they sometimes don't know something's happening. And so they use the convenience stores and their network there to let them know in time to send a lobbyist if there was, like, a local policy happening. And when they looked at the effectiveness of these programs, that's what they look at. They look at local press, and they look at the programs as evidence that you don't need restrictions, you don't need taxes. Probably now they would say you don't need flavor bans.
Right.
And that's what they cataloged with these programs. They don't look at youth smoking rates, right? They look at things like do you know who did the program, and also where did you defeat legislation?
Yeah, so, I remember an email from the youth prevention education person at Jewel the day after we realized this was a Jewel representative in 2018 who came into our school. So we sent an email that said, so what other schools in our town are you going to? And the person wrote back in 10 seconds and said, well, what other school, we'd love to partner with you. What other schools can you help us get into? And I was thinking, Big Tobacco messed with the wrong moms. But anyway, but the youth programs, I mean, I'm looking at the historic, we just saw back in February, this came up again. And so I can't remember if one of the slides is going to show that. I know it was covered in Time Magazine because we were really upset in Nevada. Could you tell us about the life skills program?
So, oh no, I don't have that one anymore. Yeah. So, I mean, life skills training is what, so the industry has become really kind of sophisticated, right, in their programming. So they usually will say that they promote like positive youth development and like a life skills training. A lot of times those programs are alternatives to anti-industry programs or really more aggressive messaging, and they'll sometimes put kind of the peer refusal skills in with a whole bunch of other things. But a lot of the industry tactic is also around making partnerships with people that have good reputations with youth, and that's what the last slide is about here, which is now Philip Morris Altria is doing less direct programming to teens and parents, but they're giving money away. So they're saying we're partnering. They have this grant portfolio where they'll make partnerships with boys and girls clubs, 4-H clubs, and they'll work with after school programs, and they'll give them money. And this is a way for them to say that they're taking meaningful action on youth smoking. They also then of course get good alliances with people that really do have a good reputation, as the tobacco companies have a terrible reputation, and this works for researchers also. Then those third parties will carry the industry message for them.
Well, so I want to ask you, and I wish we had so much more time, but I have two questions. One, the devil's advocate question, like, okay, they're not giving away, hopefully they're not giving away free product. Although, in the case of going onto a Native American reservation, we know from congressional testimony, they did, we'll give you free product to give away if you let us come and talk to people. But for the most part, if they're not giving away free product and their messaging doesn't say smoke, why is it so bad? Just so we have the context of what it really does, number one. And then number two, please give us some practical, what can we do to stop it or to counteract what they're doing?
So I think one is the programs don't actually have to promote smoking, although they have been studied, right? Some of the industry campaigns were studied, and they actually had the counter effect and caused high-risk youth to be more likely to smoke when they saw the messaging. But I think nowadays the industry doesn't have to have a insidious message or give away free product to carry out their objective, right? Which is to form good alliances, be seen as partners, and to stop legislation. So the programs are designed to undermine policy. That's the thing to keep in mind. And what can parents, you gotta, be aware of it, pay attention to who's paying for things, and really, a lot of times working with your community partners and other folks are holding them accountable around and educating them around, like, here's why you shouldn't take this money. I know it seems like it's just free money, but it really does ultimately work against our objectives.
Okay. Well, Pam Ling, this was really interesting. And I really appreciate your partnership, all of your hard work, all of your great research. So thank you. And we will make sure we will not allow the fox in the hen house if there's anything all of us who are listening today can do about it. So thank you very much.